Hello, I'm Deborah Klee, author of The Borrowed Boy and Just Be, and presenter of Castaway Books. Each week I invite one of my favourite authors to tell me about the books which have inspired their life and influenced their writing. This week I'm talking to Maria Johnson. Hello, I'm delighted to be interviewing Jo, who goes by the pen name of Maria Johnson, today on Castaway Books. And Maria has written and published 3 books. She's written 2 in the Celtic era, which are historical fiction, The Boy from the Snow, followed by The Veiled Wolf. And I have to admit, I'm only halfway through The Boy from the Snow, but I'm loving it. It's beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
And then last November, you released something quite different, a story called Lottie's Locket, which was for younger readers. And that came out in November, so a bit different. So I'm going to be asking you, Jo, for 5 books, your take on an island. I'm used to communicating with Jo by her social media name and her author name, which is Maria. So it's a novelty for me to try out your proper name, Jo. And we'll talk later on about why you go under a pen name. So welcome, Jo. Your first.
Thank you for having me.
So should we start with your first book?
Yeah, of course. So you probably have heard of it. It's called Heidi by Johanna Spyri. I looked it up how to pronounce it. I think I've pronounced it right. And it's the classic tale of little Heidi, who's about 5 years old, and she has to go stay with her grandfather up in the kind of Alps mountain range, and about her life there. I think she then at some point has to go to school, and she meets a girl called Clara who can't walk or is struggling to walk, and it's about their friendship that blossoms as well. And yeah, I think I found it really inspirational to me. It was also one of the first books I remember reading with my mum. She would read it with me. And yeah, that is a really special memory of us reading that book together.
Do you know, that triggers a memory for me, because it was my mum's favourite book as well. It must have been that generation. And I think my mum said she used to listen to it on the radio when she was a child. So my mum loved Heidi too. And she also, I won't say ahead of it, her other really favourite book was your second book. So you've got a lot in common with my dear mother. So how old were you at the time, Jo, when you were reading that? Were you reading this?
I think I was probably about 6 or 7 when I was reading it. It was probably more of my mum reading it to me. That was probably around my age. And
what was going on in your life at that time? I mean, did you have brothers, sisters? Where did you live? What sort of upbringing did you have?
So I'm from a town called Mold in North Wales, quite northeast Wales, quite close to the borders to England and to Chester. And I have one older brother, Rob, and I was about 6 or 7, so my life probably revolved around school and playing, and eating food and sleeping, and having fun outside, hopefully, probably. And it's interesting, it was around that time actually that I also, through playing with my brother's Lego set, I first got the idea for Daniel, who's my main character from my first 3 historical fiction novels in the Celtic era. So yeah, it's kind of not deliberately linked, but a coincidence that the first book on the list is also this time when I got the first idea for The Boy from the Snow.
I've read that before when I've sort of followed your blogs and your other things on social media, and I'm fascinated by the fact that you started to weave this story about Daniel from a very young age, almost as if he became a companion, a sort of imaginary friend growing up, as you sort of knitted stories around him. And was he from that era, and whatever made you think of that character in that era at such a young age, or did that happen over time?
That happened later. It wasn't until I first started writing the story of The Boy from the Snow as a kind of proper first draft, that I thought of the kind of history aspect and where he might fit in history. But when I was a child, it was just this idea of a soldier and a king, and the kind of the story, the relationship, the kind of rival relationship, because they were from two different kingdoms, and how that developed. I can't say too much because I'll give away some of the twists in the book. But my brother, he got this kind of, I think it was called Knights of the Round Table or something like that, and it had a soldier character and a king character. And yeah, I think it was just playing with those and making up this story that I just got this idea. And it stayed with me. And I first started writing it down when I was a teenager, because I realised that although obviously I'd grown up, the story had never left me. So that's when I first started writing it down.
That's interesting. Play is so important to children about feeding imagination. And I don't know whether it's just writers that get into imaginative play, but I remember I always loved imaginary games, and I didn't have many friends at school, but the children that did come around to play, I remember their mums would say to my mum, they love to come and play at your house because Deborah always makes up such wonderful imaginary games. And sometimes I'd be telling them what was going to happen next in the game as we're climbing over beds and making houses, and they're just sitting there waiting for the next bit of the story. So, yeah, imaginary games and stories are very closely linked, aren't they?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think it's so important to kind of let that grow and nurture in children as well. I think a lot of the time when we're playing with children, sometimes it's kind of based on the real world, which obviously is great and important, because we need to teach them about the real world. And things like, you have the kind of little kitchen set and let's play shopping, or let's play going to a shop and buying things. And obviously that's really important for how they'll interact and grow in the world. But I think it's also important not to necessarily leave out, if they've got a really active imagination, then yeah, just let it grow and let it nurture. And yeah, they might well become a writer in later life if they're making up stories.
And not only for writing, if you've got imagination, it can get you out of all sorts of scrapes in your life, because you've got the imagination to think beyond the barriers. You can think more broadly. I mean, imagination is so important. To have a rich imagination nurtured as a child, I think it's precious. I have two goddaughters, and when they were young, I mean, they're teens now, when they were young, the eldest, when she was about 5, I would make up imaginary tales. I would say, oh, this doll says this, and I would immediately go into my imaginary play, because I love play. I don't have to have my daughter around to enjoy that. And she goes, she's not real. That's not real. No imagination. And her sister came along, and her sister joined in, and then the older sister learned from her how to play. But I just thought it was so sad that this child of 5 or 6 had no concept of an imaginary world, because she was missing out on so much. Okay, so shall we go on to your second book?
Yeah, so this is another classic. This is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte, which is probably still my favourite book of all time. And I read it when I was about 12 or 13, and I just immediately fell in love with the character of Jane Eyre, from her difficult childhood in her aunt's house and then at Lowood School, to then going to Thornfield Hall to teach Adele the ward there, and then her relationship and friendship with Rochester and how that grows. I just completely fell in love with it. I think it's the style of writing captured me as well. It really struck me as such a kind of pronounced first person story, if that makes sense. Like, I really felt like I was with Jane on her journey and in her childhood and growing up. I think one of the first line of Jane Eyre is something like, I was glad that we weren't going for a really long walk in the cold and the wet, and she wanted to go and read a book and kind of enclose herself with those curtains as she sits on the ledge. And I think that I think I was captured by the very first page of that scene of a little girl who just wanted to go and read. I don't know whether it resonated particularly with my life at the time, because I've always loved books as well. But yeah, I was just utterly blown away by the story of Jane Eyre, and I still am, really. I think I annoy my husband because occasionally I'm like, oh, let's watch this different adaptation, because it's been made into so many films and TV series, and I don't think I've still watched them all. So yeah.
I agree. I love Jane Eyre and I love all of the Bronte's works. But I remember always wanting to have a window seat with curtains I could draw to read a book. That must be where I got it from.
Yeah, I still want one. We're going to move soon, and one of the things I'll see if I can do is to have that, if I can, a kind of window seat. And,
I know you were looking to have a library in your office, so you have to add that to your list of wants.
Yeah, we'll see.
So how old were you when you fell in love with Jane Eyre?
I was about 12 or 13, and I think it was a friend at school lent me a copy of Jane Eyre, and I ended up loving it so much that I then bought my own copy. And I just found her character so inspirational. I found her convictions quite inspirational as well. She's very open about being a Christian, and I'd only been a Christian myself for a couple of years, so I found her Christian faith. And there's a point in the book where, if you don't know the kind of huge twist, I won't spoil it, but there's a point where after the twist has happened, she's wondering what to do, and she's relying a lot on her Christian faith to give her strength to kind of do the right thing. She has to make a really tough choice, and it's only really through her trust in God that she says she was able to make that decision. So I remember finding that quite inspirational and influential at the time as well.
Yes. Do you think there are many books that have the faith in? I know I found it fascinating that C.S. Lewis, being a Christian, when he wrote all about the Tales of Narnia, that was very much based on the Christian story, wasn't it, with the lion dying at the end? So getting that message through of faith. And do you find that there are books now for young people, or is that something that is less prevalent in these times compared to the times when the Brontes were writing?
I think possibly in general, there's less of a kind of reference to Christianity and culture, maybe. I think we've become more secularized a bit, maybe, in our society. And it's not as like church and seen as more of a kind of, that's not as common as it once was kind of thing. I do have some kind of other friends who are Christian writers that I know online, and some of them are very deliberately kind of writing kind of almost allegories, kind of biblical stories coming in, and faith being a part of writing. So the historical fiction I've definitely written that with some Christian themes that come through, not as kind of bluntly as an allegory, but the main character Daniel and a couple of the other characters, and the worldview at the time is a kind of Christian worldview, because for me faith is very much a part of who I am, and you'll know this as a fellow author, that often when you're writing it gets to the heart of you, and it's a vulnerable thing, and what you have, what you believe in often bleeds through to the page. So having Daniel as a Christian, for example, and having him be part of that Christian worldview was a natural way for me to kind of bring in a Christian flavour and some themes of faith into his decision making and how he treats things and situations.
It's your voice, isn't it? I mean, as an author, our authenticity, all that we bring to the page, as you say, because you're bringing your soul to the page, is what makes our voice unique. And the other thing is that with all storytelling, it doesn't have to be blatantly giving a Christian message. Most stories have messages that we learn. Stories can be so good in helping people find strength, finding ways to cope with difficulties in life, nurturing empathy. And stories, just as in the Bible, stories are so powerful, aren't they? Which is a gift as an author, is to be able to help other people through telling stories that might inspire, motivate, or help them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to be terrible and remember this very poorly, but there's a quote that I've read or heard at some point that says there's three things you need in life. You need kind of shelter, and you need food in your belly, and then you need a good story. And that really resonates with me. And I think there's a reason why, the first civilizations, before there was necessarily the written word, people were telling each other stories. And there's something about the nature of a story and how a story can grab you and ignite your own imagination, and resonate with you, that storytelling is today, and throughout history, such a powerful thing.
Absolutely. It's how we make sense of the world, isn't it? It's within all of us wanting to tell stories and to hear stories. And that's why it's so good that there's more people being encouraged to write now, that there is the opportunity for independent and self-publishing and different ways to get published, because people paint, they make music, and there's no sort of question of you have to be a best-selling author before you're allowed to write. It's natural for us to write. It's a form of expression. It's a creativity. It's in our souls. So I love it when people say they write. And I always have this thing that when people say, but will you get published? Will you make money? When somebody starts doing a painting in their back room or whatever, nobody says, but are you going to show it at the summer exhibition? Creativity for the sake of creativity is important.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're 12, 13. I know faith's very important to you. I know that you'll tell us later, but you very important part of your life is that you're married to a vicar, and a vicar's wife has an important role. At that point, how much was religion part of your life? Were your parents religious? Or your vicar's daughter? I mean, the Brontes, wasn't their father a vicar?
Yes, yeah, he was. There's a great documentary actually called my brain has gone. There's a really good BBC documentary drama about the life of the Brontes, and it's brilliant. And I'll see if I can kind of half remember the title as we go through. To answer your question, I think my dad would describe himself as, he became a Christian in later life, but he describes himself as kind of, I was a seeker, but I wasn't kind of convinced yet, or like I was searching for the answer, but I didn't know what it was yet type seeking person. But it was when I was about 8, so a couple of years after, I suppose, when I read Heidi, my parents, it was actually my dad, bumped into the vicar at the gym, and they ended up having chats, and then my parents ended up going to church off the back of that, and they did a course called Alpha, which kind of takes you through the Christian faith, and my brother and I were baptized, and it was from that point that we kind of had faith a lot more in our lives. So yeah, it was definitely a gradual process for me, learning a lot. I mean, I was still only about 9. I knew that I wanted to be a Christian and that I trusted in Jesus, but there was a lot of growing that I did in terms of understanding what the faith was and what it would mean and look like to be a Christian. There was a great church we went to when I was a teenager that taught me a lot more about what faith was in Christ, and talking more about the Christian faith. There was particularly a teenage Bible study that I went to that was quite influential. And then again, when I went to university, it was during Freshers Week, and I was a bit homesick. It was the first time I'd ever been away from my family for more than a couple of days, or a few days. And I was actually flyered by somebody in the Christian Union that told me about these events. They were called lunch bars, and it was a talk, and then you'd kind of have a chat about the talk, and there was free food. And I think, and then through that, I started going to a church where I went to university, and that was really influential for me, because that was the first time that it was a kind of church that I was going to as an adult. And so then it wasn't just kind of, oh, well, I'm going because my parents go to church. It was kind of, this is something I'm going to own for myself. Which was, again, quite a turning point, I suppose, in my life.
It's very important stages of your life, making who you are. Good. So take us on to book 3.
Okay, I'm slightly kind of cheating in that they're kind of 3 books. The Lord of the Rings trilogy, which was massively inspirational for me. I started reading it when I was about 14 or 15, and I was just instantly blown away by Middle-earth and the world that Tolkien created. It's just such a brilliant story, and the adventures that the friends had, and a lot about friendship as well. And looking back, I can actually see how elements of Lord of the Rings have been influenced on The Boy from the Snow. And there's a couple of characters that in my historical fiction novels that I can actually think, oh, I can see that for example, there's a character called Sarah, who's one of Daniel's oldest friends. And it was a few years ago that I then kind of, since after writing like the first draft of The Boy from the Snow, we then watched The Lord of the Rings, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, I've totally based Sarah on Éowyn. And I hadn't quite realised I'd consciously done that, but there's elements about Sarah's character and what happens to Sarah that is definitely drawing comparison with Éowyn and her character.
Yeah. When I read Lord of the Rings years ago, it came out as one big fat volume. It didn't come in 3 parts. It was only later, I think it was made into 3 separate books. I read it from beginning to end when I was 15, one long hot summer. Great book. How old were you when you were reading it?
Very similar age. I was 14 or 15. And it was actually one big book when I had it. And I think it was my dad's copy. And it all started because my brother bet me £1 that I couldn't read it. And so then I started reading it, and I was just utterly hooked. I read every single page, including, the maps and the songs, because I was utterly blown away. I made a joke that he only paid me back a few years ago, so I really should have asked for interest. But yeah, I absolutely loved it. Yeah.
I read it a second time though, having completed it, and I wished I had, really, because I remember how much I enjoyed it at the time.
Yeah, I really enjoy the films as well.
I couldn't watch them because I don't really like fantasy. I liked it when I was 15 and enjoyed it, but maybe I said this to another author, I think it was Elizabeth, when I spoke to her, and I said, oh, I'll try it. I will try reading fantasy. I haven't yet, but I will. Okay, so then you go on to your next book, which is one that people may not have heard of. Let you introduce it.
Yeah, I don't have a physical copy because it's on my Kindle, but it's called Ozbert by a guy called R.A. Courier, who is an author on Twitter. And I came across that about 3 years ago. Boy from the Snow had only just been published a couple of months before, and I first met R.A. Courier on Twitter, and it was through just different writing groups and threads and chats, and ended up having a few conversations with him. And I really liked the sound of his book. And so, yeah, I got it and I read it, and it was absolutely incredible. So it's a historical fiction, and it's the story of a shepherd living in medieval northern England, and the adventures that he has with his cousin Tolly one summer. And also another big aspect of the book is that Ozbert lives with what other people call his demons, which today would be bipolar disorder. So it's also very kind of open about mental health and the importance of talking about mental health today. And it was also the first kind of self-published indie book that I ever came across, ever read, and I was utterly blown away. It's now kind of one of my top 5 books that I've ever read. The writing is just astounding, and the treatment of mental health is so important and well done, and it's just great. It's just a really, really amazing book. And since reading Ozbert, I suppose my bookshelf, if you like, has become much more independent, self-published books rather than the kind of big traditional bookshop books.
It's really interesting. I know you're a great supporter of indie published authors, which is fantastic. And I read your review of Ozbert, and the next book you're going to tell us about, and I could see just your passion for those books. So certainly sold them to me. So I would be interested in reading them. And I hope people who are viewers and listeners will follow up with the links on my website and have a look at them themselves. But it's interesting that there are more indie authors now, but there's some really, really good indie authors out there. And I wonder whether writing will follow the way that the indie music did, that especially now, during this period where you can't get to bookshops, everybody seems to be on the sort of similar level, platform, all trying to get their books out there through ebooks and social media. It's just changing times.
Yeah, definitely. And I really do hope that indie authors become even more kind of visible and recognised as kind of, because I think hopefully we're a bit removed from it, but there's still the stereotype of, oh, well, a self-published book's not quite kind of legit. There'll be loads of typos, or, it just won't be as good as, in quote marks, as a traditionally published book, which personally I just think is a complete load of rubbish. I've read some of the best self-published indie books this past year, like Ozbert and like the book that I'm going to review next. And I mean, I'm sure I'd pick up loads of different bookshops in Smiths or Waterstones or what the equivalent is, Barnes and Noble or big American bookshops, and they'd be great, and I'm sure I'd really enjoy them. But I kind of feel like half the battle, or no, more like 80% of the battle for indie authors is just being visible, just being seen. There's so many great books out there, and you're kind of one author swimming in this ocean, which is why the writing community on Twitter is so important, I think, because we're all kind of trying to support each other and help each other and kind of make each other's books visible, because that's so much of it is just being seen as, oh, there's this book that looks good, I will check it out. The kind of what an author has to do just to get a reader to kind of see it and look, oh, that looks interesting, is quite a big journey. So yeah, it's definitely something that I'm interested in reading these books.
So rewarding when you discover a new indie author. It's amazing. It's like finding a little jewel. There's so many, as you say, out there. I must admit, the thing is with indie publishing is that many indie authors have the same creatives around them that a publishing house does in terms of the structural editor, the copywriter, the proofreader, the cover designer. So really, they're just as professional. But what I get frustrated by, I love going into a bookshop. I love having a book in my hand as well as getting the ebooks and the indie author books. But I get frustrated by the whole marketing thing, that you get a whole range of books that all have a very similar title or a similar cover. I used to go into my local bookshop and pull out a book and say, now look, this one has got motifs all around and the word lost in it, and so is this one, and so is this one, and so is this one. And sometimes the title and the cover have been put on there to make you think it's a certain type of book, and then it doesn't fit the book at all. It's just a marketing ploy. So I kind of get frustrated and angry at the whole commercialization to market books. It's got such a big thing that instead of the editors leading, things seem to be much more led by the marketing in publishing, which is a shame, because it means that sometimes really good books don't get to the top and get seen and visible, even though they're excellent. Okay, so we're going to your next book.
Yeah, so again, this is another indie read, and it's the Empire's Legacy trilogy, which again I read as one book, by Marion L. Thorpe, and I was again just blown away by this story. I read it last kind of September, October time. And I'd had, probably because of lockdown, I'd had a bit of a slump with kind of both reading and writing. I was deep into the edits of my third historical fiction novel, and I'd lost a bit of motivation with that. And I hadn't read something like I hadn't read a book for quite a while, actually, because I think I was a bit fed up with my own words. It's sometimes if you've spent the day staring at your own words and feeling a bit frustrated about them, it can then be quite hard to then read someone else's words, because the brain power has already gone by that point in the day. And so this book was probably the first book I read that kind of broke that spell and got me back into reading. And it's the story of Lena, and it's an alternative historical fiction, or you might call it a historical fantasy, based in the Dark Ages era. And kind of a bit earlier than my own historical fiction, which is kind of post-Roman. This is kind of when what would be the Roman Empire at its peak, but because it's alternate fiction, it's not actually called the Roman Empire, but it's kind of the equivalent of that in Marion Thorpe's world. And it's about Lena, and we meet her when she's living in this coastal village, and there's the main kind of, I suppose, alternative history comes into the fact that the village life, the structure of the way people live, they live according to something called partition, where all the men are away at war, kind of from early age. They go and get trained as soldiers, and then they're serving the empire. And the women stay behind in the villages and the towns, and they do everything. So Lena's a fisherwoman. You also have female blacksmiths, female weavers, female farmers, female everything. The women are in charge of all the towns and the villages. And the novel starts with a soldier coming back to the town and saying that the women are going to have to learn how to fight. And Lena has to make a difficult decision about this, because it's kind of the tradition. It kind of goes against the traditions that they have and the agreement that was made a couple of hundred years ago that women would do this and men would do that. And the choice that Lena makes then spans her, like it kicks off her journey, and ends up with her traveling to kind of the other end of the empire almost. And it's about what happens to her and her story. And it's just an amazing book. Again, just superbly written, brilliant plot, brilliant characters. And it's got, I really like the genre of historical fantasy, because it's kind of this world and not this world at the same time. And I really like that blend. So yeah, I really enjoyed those 3 books, that one book.
Yes, I hadn't come across Marion L. Thorpe before I read your book choices. And then I was reading about her backgrounds and interests, and fascinating. I really would look forward to reading her books too. Good choice. So what's happening in your life now? Because we kind of got a big jump. We've gone from you being 15 up to now to adulthood, and I think that you're a bit more than 18. So
Yeah, just like.
So tell me a little bit about life now. What's life like now for you?
So at the moment we're just about to move, actually. So when we went to Bible college, my husband went to Bible college. I could go to some of the lectures for free as a spouse. He was the one studying, so that he could be kind of trained up to do what he does now. And he's been a curate these last 3 years, which is like an assistant vicar. And then he's just got his first ever vicar job. So we're going to move where he's going to be vicar of 2 churches in kind of Greater Manchester area. So we're not moving very far away. But yeah, that's what kind of life looks like at the moment. We're kind of wrapping things up where we are and preparing to move. It's a bit hard. We have to move during lockdown. And yeah, we have to kind of, it's always a bit of a tug. It's part of the life of being married to a minister, and you go to a church and you're in a church job, which is often transitory, and then you go somewhere else, and there's always a bit of a tug, because you've just gotten to the point where you feel like you've gotten to know people really well, and you've made good friendships, and you feel really settled, and then you have to move again.
And do you move into a rectory? Is there a house that goes with the job, or do you find your own?
Yeah, there'll be a vicarage, which we're going to see next week, for the inside of it for the first time. So that'll be exciting.
That must be really strange, having to have the house that you're given and not go and choose your house.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't feel, I suppose it's never felt that strange for us. Because, well, we were used to rented accommodation when we had different jobs, when we first graduated and that kind of thing. And then I guess we knew it was part of the life and part of the package, that you often get housing supplied and provided as part of the job, rather than kind of going on Rightmove and whatever and choosing your own accommodation.
You must get more into your community than most people would, because you have to be very much part of it, because vicar's wife is an important role. So it must be even harder to uproot when you've made all of those links.
Yeah, you definitely get kind of dunked into the community straight away, which is great. It can feel a bit intimidating when you kind of you join a new church family, and they all know your name, and you know the name of about 5 people, and some of them this happened at one of the first events that we went to kind of meet people, where we are now, and everybody was so welcoming and friendly, but actually not everyone told us their name. So they'd come up and say, "Oh, you're Joe," and I'm thinking, "Yeah, who are you?" Because it's so hard to kind of learn people's names very quickly as well. But yeah, we've made really good friendships here, and that's the nice thing about a kind of church community as well, that it's, whereas if you end up sometimes, because sometimes it's kind of hobby based or work based where you find your friendships, which is great, but sometimes those environments aren't that diverse. You might find people that have similar background as you, or similar age to you, or if you've trained in a similar field, you might have those interests. And one of the things I love about the church community is that, just like a real family, it's just so diverse, and so many people, different people, kind of cross generations, entirely different backgrounds, and some people that you may never have met in another context. You may never have, because they're so different to you, or they've got such different hobbies or background or whatever, you might never have kind of become friends with them in the nicest possible way. But so, yeah, that's one of the things that I really enjoy. So looking forward to starting that process again when we move soon.
We wish you well with that. I'm just going to say, I think clubs and associations, whatever they are, whether they're church or other community associations and clubs, are so important at connecting people across the community, especially people who tend to get isolated, lonely, or are new in a community. Joining clubs and associations, they're kind of the infrastructure that pulls, like, I think of it, a web pulling everybody together within a community and making people feel included. And I worry about another of the problems with lockdown. Having Zoom and everything is one thing, but losing those clubs and associations and the contact people have at those, that's been a big loss for lots of people. And I'm sure people not going into the church has also had an effect upon some of the more lonely parishioners.
Yeah, definitely. It has been just so isolating. I mean, we've been quite fortunate in where we are. We've been able to do quite a lot of things online, but I know that lots of people haven't been able to do that. And even if you do have the online resources, it's never the same as when you met people physically. I mean, for me, because I work from home, kind of writing is what I try and do as my kind of main job career type thing. So I don't have kind of anything else in the day that's work where I would meet colleagues and that kind of thing. So a lot of my interaction, if you like, apart from, during the week, where I might go for a coffee with someone, a lot of my interaction came on a Sunday where I'd meet with people from church and chat to them and talk to my friends. And then suddenly in the space of a week, that whole kind of physical gathering network that I had just went. I mean, church is still active. We do stuff online, but in terms of meeting people, and that was such a hard shift because, it then went for a long time that the only people I saw were my husband and my dog, which, obviously is fine, but it was lovely to have physically have those relationships as well. And one of the hard things about moving is that we'll have left before restrictions have lifted properly, and we'll have left before we can physically meet with those people to say goodbye. So you might have to come visit and say goodbye to people physically when we're able to.
And it'll be a challenge for you settling into the new community, as other people who have moved to new communities during the pandemic would have found. Okay, it's been lovely talking to you. Wish you well with your move and all the challenges that will present. But before you go, I'll ask you about a luxury that you want to take with you. Now, I'm going to let you have a Bible and all those books, all of those books and writing materials. So you'll be able to read and write and read the Bible. So what other luxury might you like to take with you?
I'm going to sound incredibly British and go for tea. I love a good cup of tea. I blame my mum because the kettle is always on. And so, would love a good cup of tea to have with me, even if it's really hot on whatever desert island I'm going to. I'd love to have that cup of tea.
I think there's a great choice. I'm with you there. It's been lovely talking to you, Jo, author name Maria Johnson. And I'll have all of the links up on my website as always. So those two books that others might not have heard of by the indie authors, indie publishers, they can look up and read, as well as your own. So thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you. It's been great. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed listening to this week's episode of Castaway Books. References for all of the books discussed in this show can be found on my website, which is www.abrahkdeborah.wordpress.com. It's the letter K and then my name, Deborah, Deborah. So until next week, goodbye.